invitation to give me the opportunity to visit you here at the Council of Europe, my first visit to the Council. Thank you all who have come to take part in this discussion. I value it particularly because the Council of Europe has been important in developing animal welfare policies in Europe. Historically, the initiatives that were taken by the European Union, some of which I will mention in this talk, developed from conventions of the Council of Europe that were earlier in time than the directives of the European Union. So it's played an important role, and I hope that the Council of Europe can again play an important role in improving the welfare of animals throughout Europe and ultimately, by example, throughout the world. What I want to do today is to begin with some of the philosophical views that have been presented with regard to animals in the past and present, and develop what I see as the most defensible ethical approach to animals, and then talk a little bit about some of the practices that exist with regard to animals, which seem to be the most significant from the animal welfare perspective, and finally look a little bit towards the future and what we can hope for to develop in the next few years. So let's going back right to the beginning of Europe and European philosophy, European thought, which emerges out of ancient Greece. And although there were certainly different views put forward in ancient Greece, different approaches that were relevant to questions about animals, the one that became most influential in Europe was that of Aristotle, represented here by the quote that I have, which is obviously not a very friendly attitude to animals. It suggests that the world is a hierarchy in which the lower exists for the sake of the higher, so the plants for the sake of animals, and the brute beasts, the animals, exist for the sake of man or human beings. And in fact, Aristotle actually is more specific still in terms of this hierarchy, because he thinks that the less rational humans exist for the sake of the more rational humans. And by that means, he justifies slavery by claiming that the so-called barbarians, who the Greeks enslaved, are less rational than the Greeks themselves. Nobody, of course, would defend that claim today as a justification of slavery. But something like this idea that Aristotle put forward about animals, you can still see in its working through in the way that we relate to animals today. And I'll say a little bit more about how that developed. As I said, this is not the only approach taken in ancient Greece. We know, for example, that the school of Pythagoras practiced vegetarianism. We don't quite know why. We don't have actual documents. We have nothing comparable to the works of Plato and Aristotle, for instance, that have survived from the Pythagoreans. But we can only speculate as to how the relations of humans and animals in Europe might have been different if it had been the school of Pythagoras rather than that of Aristotle, which came into the European tradition. But the other great influence in the European tradition came from outside Europe in terms of the Hebrew tradition of the creation of the world. And it has a somewhat similar view. You can see why it was not difficult for these views to be brought together, to be harmonized. Because in the Hebrew tradition, we get the idea also that humans have dominion over the other animals. That this is a divinely granted gift of dominion. godlike. Humans are made in the image of God, the others are not. So we are in some way special. This idea of dominion has standardly been interpreted to mean one of ruling over them without having to answer to God for how we treat them. That's not the only way to interpret this verse, but it has been, unfortunately, the dominant interpretation for most of European history. And it's only been a few voices that have become stronger more recently that have said, this word that is here rendered as dominion should rather be understood as a kind of stewardship, just as you might entrust the care of your estate to a steward to look after it, to manage it well. So some now interpret this verse as saying that God is entrusting us to look after the animals, but not to rule over them simply for our own benefit. But that, as I say, is not really been the dominant interpretation. And we see this in particular if we skip ahead a long time to medieval Europe, where we find Thomas Aquinas, his great work is to put together the Christian and the Greek traditions. The Christian tradition incorporating, of course, the Hebrew tradition that I just quoted, and the Greek tradition represented specifically by Aristotle, because it was Aristotle's works that became known in Europe at that time. The works of Plato became known later. The Pythagorean works, as I said, we are still not known. But Aristotle had been preserved in the Islamic world, among the scholars of Islam, and came to Europe at that time. Now, this view of Aquinas is really incorporates, I would say, the worst interpretations of both the Greek and the Judeo-Christian traditions as far as animals are concerned. And you see here Aquinas specifically saying that it doesn't matter what we do to animals. Here, in this line, he says it's because of God giving us dominion over them. In other passages, Aquinas wrote a lot, of course, and I don't want to quote it all, but in other passages, he explicitly says that we cannot sin with regard to animals because they do not share in the fellowship of eternal life. So the only beings that have an immortal soul are beings that you can sin against. So there's no category in Aquinas' idea for sins directly against animals. The only reason why it is wrong to torture animals merely for the fun of it, according to Aquinas, is that this might lead you to be cruel to humans. So the bad aspect of it is not the suffering of the animals because you are torturing them. The bad aspect of it is that you may harden your nature and become cruel to humans. So you could not have a more unequivocal statement of the idea that animals in themselves do not matter. And this, from the most influential Christian philosopher for many centuries, from the 13th century until at least the 19th, if not into the 20th century. Thomas Aquinas was undoubtedly the most influential philosopher in the Roman Catholic tradition. So it sets a very negative view about what we owe to animals. And unfortunately, that, I think, is still influential in the attitudes that some have. Sorry, I don't know why that popped up. Okay. And a view not so different from that of Aquinas was still continuing to be expressed by the greatest philosopher of, the greatest European philosopher, perhaps you could say, or the greatest continental century, Immanuel Kant, who also took the view that we have no direct duties to animals. His explanation was not in terms of dominion. His ethic did not depend explicitly on religion in that way, but it was the idea that animals are not self-conscious. And from that, he concluded that therefore they are just a means to an end, whereas the end is always human beings. Today we can ask, why does Kant think that self-consciousness is necessary to be an end? Why isn't simply consciousness, the capacity to feel pain, enough to make you an end in yourself? That is, enough to mean that there is some way in which you can be wronged, you can be harmed. Because you can feel pain, somebody can inflict pain on you without a sufficient justification, then you are wronged, and I would say therefore you become an end in yourself, because what states you're in matters. And some contemporary Kantians actually acknowledge that Kant got this wrong, that there is a mistake here, an argument from the idea that in order to be a moral agent, you have to have some self-consciousness or self-awareness. That is, for you to be blamed for what you do, you have to be sufficiently self-aware to be able to think about what you're doing and to consider alternatives to it. But that's very different from saying that to be what we might call a moral patient, that is an object of moral significance, you also have to be self-conscious. And I would argue that that's false, that's a mistake that Kant made, that all is necessary for that is that you be conscious. You're not a moral agent, you can't be blamed for what you're doing, but others can be blamed for doing something to you quite directly, not merely because of the consequences it might have for human beings. So those are the leading attitudes that I think have been important in shaping European thought about animals up to the end of the 18th century. And it's around that time that we see a very different tradition developing in the thought of Jeremy Bentham, the founding father of the English utilitarian school of moral philosophy. This quotation from Bentham is only a footnote to his important work, The Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. But it's quite a significant footnote all the same. He's talking about animals here. He says, he notes that just recently, he was writing just after the French Revolution had occurred, just recently the French had recognized that the color of a person's skin is not a reason for denying them rights. And he says, in this footnote, one day perhaps people will come to realize that other anatomical features that differentiate humans and animals, how many legs they have or how thick their skin is, are equally insufficient for saying that it doesn't matter if a being is tortured or suffers. And Bentham then imagines somebody objecting, but wait a minute, they can't reason like we do, or they can't talk like we do. And this is his response. He says, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And that, I think, was a really important understanding philosophically, that it's suffering that is the crucial line as to whether a being really has interests and can be harmed and therefore can be an end in itself. Shortly, a few decades after Bentham put forward this idea, we started to get the first animal welfare legislation in England, although extremely inadequate, very weak, but at least the idea started to be taken seriously. And we also had another revolution in thought that was very important for this area. And this came from Charles Darwin, who's shown here as a young man. At the time he made these observations in his notebooks. This is 1837 to 8, 20 years before the publication of The Origin of Species, and even longer before the publication of The Descent of Man. But he already had the idea that humans are special because a God created them separately from the rest of creation is an arrogant idea that we attribute to ourselves. Oh yes, we are so important because we alone are in the image of God. And he had this other idea, which he thinks is both true and more humble for humans, to think that we are created from animals, that we are descendants from animals and not a separate creation. And that also, I think, helped to break down this gulf that we had placed between ourselves and non-human animals. And then in that later work I mentioned, The Descent of Man, Darwin goes further and develops the parallels between humans and animals in support of his theory about the fact that we have descended from animals, not only with physical and anatomical parallels, which of course he also developed in great detail, but also with psychological parallels. That the animals, like us, also are capable of pleasure and pain, happiness and misery, and we can see it in them when we look at the way, for example, kittens and lambs play. We can see their enjoyment of life, like we see this with our own children. And he could also have added, we see it also when they're in pain, that their behaviour is like ours. So the gulf is here shrinking, and we are starting to get more seriously the possibility of taking seriously the interests of animals as beings entitled to moral consideration. So that brings us up to roughly where we are today in our thinking. And I believe that we have moved away from the very harsh view of Aristotle, the dominion view, and of Aquinas and of Kant. And there's been at least some influence from the views that animals suffer and that is enough reason to take their interests into account. So what I think is the point that we have reached today, what I'm calling the majority view today, and I have a question mark after that heading because this is not based on any clear polling, but it does seem that most people today, let's confine ourselves to Europe, or it becomes more speculative if we talk about the world as a whole, but most people would say we ought to be kind to animals. We do have direct duties, contrary to Aquinas, contrary to Kant. We do have direct duties to non-human animals, to be kind to them, to avoid being cruel to them. Their interests count, but they may be overridden by our own interests, for example, in feeding and clothing ourselves, or many other interests that people may have. So I think that's the view that a lot of the people hold, and as you can see, it's somewhat vague, a somewhat vague view, because it says, yes, we ought to be kind to animals, we ought not to be cruel to them, but our interests override theirs, and there's no clear specification of what the boundary is, or when they override them, or why, or what cruelty is, and why. So I think this view has problems when you try and reflect on it rather more. So I now need to say just a little bit about how I understand ethics. I think that ethics is not purely subjective. It's not just a matter of me saying, how do I feel about something, and you saying, how do you feel about something, and we can just exchange our views and not take the discussion any further. Of course, there are some things that are like that. You may like strawberries, and I might prefer apricots, and there's no point in arguing about that as to which is the more delicious fruit to eat. But in ethics, we do argue, and we do feel that there's an obligation to present some reasons for our view. And if you're going to start drawing distinctions, for example, between humans and non-human animals, you have to be able to defend that, offer some reasons for it, or between different forms of different practices that you approve of or disapprove of. So the problem is whether the majority view I described can do this. And here's an example. So with apologies to those from Spain, perhaps, majority European opinion, I think I can confidently say, rejects the bullfight as a form of entertainment. Cultural differences, but most Europeans would say this is not acceptable, and attempts to introduce it in countries in Europe where it does not exist would be very likely to be rejected. You could take other examples as well. You could take other forms of animal use, like in the United States a few years ago, there was a big scandal about a famous football player being involved in dogfighting, and provoked a huge public outrage. He went instantly from being a hero to many people because of his football skills to being the worst kind of villain. He was convicted and sentenced to prison. He served, I think, I can't remember, 18 months, something like that in prison. And when he came out, he wanted to resume his career, and some people thought he should never play football again. He should spend the rest of his life in prison. There was a lot of extreme reaction to that because he was involved in dogfighting. So you get a lot of things that people reject very strongly. But then you get other things that they do not reject. So this is broiler production, chicken meat production, which is of course a very popular food that people consume. And yet I would say there is far more suffering going on in this shed, in this photograph. At the moment that photograph is taken, there is much more suffering occurring than there was in the bull ring that I showed you. Partly, of course, it's just a matter of the numbers. There are 20,000 chickens probably in this shed. They are all in conditions that they were not naturally suited for. They never evolved to live in such enormous flocks, and there are studies showing that they are stressed because they cannot recognize the other individuals. In a flock of 50 or 80 birds, each chicken will know each individual bird and will know whether that bird is superior to it in the pecking order or inferior, and therefore can get out of the way or can dominate that bird. That can't happen with 20,000 birds. There's a lot of crowding, as you can see. The other thing that you can't see from the photo, but if you've ever been in one of these sheds, as I have, the air is full of ammonia. The droppings of the birds just are lying there on the floor, and despite ventilation, fans there, when you walk into this thing, the first thing you notice is this sensation in your nose and your throat and your eyes because of the high levels of ammonia in these sheds. The other thing that will be happening, again, that you can't see, but these birds are bred to grow extremely quickly. The chicken that you buy in the supermarket, if you do buy chickens in supermarkets, is only 6 weeks old, and it's reached this size at 6 weeks of age. It's bred to grow extremely quickly. But it's a very young bird, and its bones may be too immature to support its body weight. So it can happen, it's a regular occurrence in fact, that some of these birds' legs collapse. So their legs collapse under them, and if they are not able to reach food or water, you can see in this picture the long lines that's bringing food and water to the birds. If they are not able to reach that, they will die of thirst or starve to death. There's no one going to come through the shed and look at every bird and check whether it's sick or something suffering going on in this shed than there is in the bull ring, where there's only one animal that is, I would say, being tortured, but it's relatively brief, and the rest of its existence is not so bad. This is the question for the majority view. Why do we tolerate one thing, this, and reject the other? Now you might say, well, that's because we need to eat, but we don't need to watch bullfights. We could go and watch football instead, where there are no victims being killed. But it's not really true that we need to eat chicken. We can survive perfectly well as vegetarians or vegans without eating meat or without eating animal products. So it's also an option. This is also something that is not essential to our survival or our health or our well-being or our productivity or to feeding hundreds of millions of people. So it's again a choice really that we're making. And that's why I think the majority view has this great problem in saying, yes, we should be kind to animals, but our interests override theirs, even when our interests are not our essential interests, but rather just our interest in having a particular kind of food rather than a different kind that would nourish us just as well. So this is a view, this is what I would suggest we should put in place of the majority view, the view that I call equal consideration. It's the idea that if beings have interests, we should give equal consideration to those interests, irrespective of the species of the being. Another way of putting this would be simply to say, pain is just as bad whatever the being who feels it. So the pain of a chicken or a dog or a cow or a pig is just as bad as a similar amount of pain experienced by a human being. And that's, I think, a view that can be consistently held and consistently applied without leading to the kinds of paradoxes and problems that we get for the majority, what I call the majority view. And what I'm suggesting here is that we reject speciesism, which is a term that I've helped to popularize, in order to make the parallel with these other isms that we are familiar with and that we reject. So the obvious parallels are with racism and sexism. If we go back one slide, if we replace species here with race or sex, then obviously everybody in this room, I'm sure, will reject it. That's what the Council of Europe is about. Right? If somebody said, well, we can give less consideration to people when they're not members of our race or when they're not members of my sex, everybody would say that's outrageous. You can't defend such a view. And of course I agree. But if those boundaries, the boundaries of race or sex, are not morally relevant, not morally decisive for how much consideration we should give to a being, then why would the boundary of species be morally crucial to how much weight we should give to the interests of a being? I can't see why that is really any different from these other boundaries. It's as if we started out with a small circle of moral consideration when people considered only their own tribe, and then expanded to their own nation or their own race or people of their own culture. And then, with things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we push that out to the boundaries of our species. And then we say it should stop there. But why should it stop there? Why should just bringing it to include all of our species be the end of the process, when there are billions of beings who can also suffer pain who are not members of our species? And if you say, well, it's because we are different, maybe with Kant you say because we are self-conscious, or like those who are objecting to Bentham, you say we can reason or we can talk, then let's remember that after all there are human beings protected by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and by the international conventions that exist in the European Convention on Human Rights. There are human beings who are not able to talk or to reason or to be self-aware. All of us were in that situation once, and some, of course, are in that situation always because of intellectual disabilities. But we don't think that, therefore, they should have no rights or that their suffering does not matter, that we're justified in giving less consideration to their suffering. On the contrary, we protect them, and we think that's an important thing that we've done. So we can't use those criteria to justify excluding animals from this sphere without at the same time implying that we could again withdraw that protection from those categories of human beings who lack rationality or self-consciousness or language. Now, of course, it is part of my argument that we are talking about conscious beings or sentient beings. And so just very briefly, I think this is something that almost everybody accepts now, but we do need to say, how do we know that animals are conscious? And I suggest three different types of reasons. The anatomical and physiological similarities that they have to us, which we know in great detail now. The behavioural parallels, which Darwin already mentioned, the fact that they behave in similar ways to us when they're happy or when they're in pain. And also, from Darwin, we know that we have a shared evolutionary history with these beings. So it's very plausible to suppose that they have the same ways, their nervous systems respond in the same ways to pain and to pleasure that ours do, and that there's the same mental states going on. It's not as if somebody has developed clever robots that mimic human pain. Of course, we can do that now. We can build toys that look as if, little dogs that look as if they're happy and thank you when you give them some water or something. We can do that, but we know that that was deliberately designed to mimic human beings. Whereas with non-human animals, we know that we have evolved from a common ancestor without that deliberate intention to mimic pain behaviour without any pain. But that does raise the question about how far does this consciousness go? Where is there a line to draw? And my answer to that is that there is not really a sharp line, but there is a continuum. There is a spectrum. And at the top of this list, we have those that are closest to us, where I would say the evidence for consciousness is overwhelming, is conclusive. I think to deny that birds and mammals are capable of suffering pain flies in the face of a huge amount of scientific evidence. I would say that in terms of all vertebrates, the evidence for pain is very strong. There has been some debate about fish, but I think now we've had more studies, I'll mention a little bit later in this talk, that show that fish can also feel pain. So I would include all vertebrates, and I would not say that only vertebrates can feel pain, because if you consider the behaviour of some invertebrates, it's hard to believe that they are not conscious. I would recommend, if you haven't already seen it, to go to YouTube and to Google something about octopus behaviour or octopus opening jars. There is some remarkable footage. You can give an octopus in a tank a glass jar with a screw-top lid, obviously something it's never encountered before in nature, and you put inside it something that it would like to eat, some food, and within minutes the octopus will work out how to open that screw-top jar with its tentacles and get at the morsel inside it. It has to be a conscious being, I think, to be able to solve that puzzle. But as you go further with other invertebrates, it becomes less clear. Again, there's been recent research about crabs that does suggest they can feel pain, and that would certainly apply to lobster as well. About insects, I'm much more agnostic. Again, that's a wide variety of creatures, but it's more possible to explain their behaviour without consciousness than it is for the other animals that I've mentioned. So I just don't know. I would give them the benefit of the doubt where possible, but it's much more difficult to do that with insects, always. And when you get down to simple bivalves like clams and mussels and oysters, I don't know. I would not be prepared to say that they are conscious. It becomes much more doubtful. So there's a spectrum, there's a line, and it's difficult to say exactly where you should draw it, but it depends, I think, on the circumstances, and it depends on balancing the needs we have to maintain our own life. And of course, the last question I just leave with you, we don't know exactly what the consciousness of these beings is like, particularly when we get down to those that are further from us, where it's harder for us to understand their behaviour and their nervous systems are more widely distinct from ours. So that's a question which there's a lot of research going on, and they're sure we will learn more answers in the future. Okay, now just to clarify this idea of equal consideration of interest, it's not saying that all animals should be treated the same. Sometimes people like to ridicule ideas that are a bit challenging to them. And they say, you know, well, does this mean that we have to treat all animals the same? That we should give cows the same kind of rights that we give to humans? Well, that's not the case. In fact, we don't give the same rights to all humans even. I mean, some rights we do, but some basic rights we do, but others, like a right to vote, obviously, we do not give to children. So animals have different interests, different species. These calves with their mothers are having their interests met at this particular time anyway. They have plenty to eat. The weather is suitable for them. They are socialising in a natural group with their mothers. They have protection from predators or from inclement weather if they need it. So their interest is satisfied. Our interest would not be. We have a lot of other interests. We, for example, have an interest in having an education so that we can participate fully in our society in ways that we cannot without an education. So, you know, don't let the idea of equal consideration of interests turn into some kind of fantastic claims that animals and humans have to be treated in the same way. It's just we have to consider their interests for what they are and not give them less weight just because they're animals than we give to our own interests. And the more complicated question, which I'm just mentioning and don't really have time to fully discuss, is questions about the interest in continuing to live. So I have here a quotation from a conservative British philosopher, Roger Scruton. I put it as a representative of a view that I do think has some philosophical basis. Not necessarily that I accept this view, but I think it's an arguable kind of view, that there is a difference in the way in which premature death constitutes a loss for normal human beings. I am here talking about human beings who are not small children, not infants anyway, and who are intellectually aware of their own existence and able to think about their own future. And normal humans in that category, I think, when, as Scruton says, when they die prematurely, we feel that that's a tragic loss because they were not able to achieve what they wanted to achieve. They were not able to fulfill their wishes and desires. And we all are very much future-oriented beings in that sense. So I'm sure all of you have some thoughts about what you're going to do after this talk finishes, about what you're going to do this evening, about what you're going to do next weekend, about what you're going to do in your summer vacation, and perhaps what you're going to do some future time, 2 years hence or 5 years hence. Now, I doubt that non-human animals have these kinds of thoughts. Maybe some of them do, but I doubt that all of the vertebrates, for instance, that I said are capable of feeling pain, have any thoughts about what they will do next summer, if indeed they even have the concept of the seasons rolling around. So, if they die, that's a loss of their enjoyment of life, if they were enjoying their life. But it's not something that makes their wishes and hopes, the wishes and hopes of the past, as something that could not be fulfilled, because I don't think they would have had those longer-term wishes and hopes. So I do think that that could be a basis for saying that normal humans have an interest in continuing to live a normal lifespan, which is different anyway from those that non-human animals have. And that does make it more serious to end their lives against their will, against their desires. And so, I don't think the principle of equal consideration of interest automatically tells you that it's just as wrong to kill a cow as it is to kill a normal human. I think it's compatible with the idea that when something tragic happens, and a lot of people are killed, for instance, in an earthquake or a terrorist attack or whatever it might be, that's a great tragedy that's much greater than the death of a similar number of non-human animals. Okay, so that's now given you the philosophical outline of what I want to argue and how I would want to defend it. Both where we've come from philosophically, where we are, and where I think we should go. Let me say a little bit about what has been happening, as I see it, a brief overview, in terms of animal welfare in Europe in the last couple of decades, and then I'll say a little bit about where we may be heading, should be heading. So, it's a big area, again, and I do want to allow you time for questions, so I'm going to focus particularly on what I see as by far the biggest animal welfare area, and that is the number of the animals raised for food. Because, as I indicate here, this dwarfs the other problems in terms of numbers. And again, I think numbers matter, just as I think what was going on in that chicken shed was worse than what was going on in the bullring because of the numbers. So I think what is happening to animals in agriculture is worse than what happens to animals used in research, because there are 600 times as many animals raised for food, these are worldwide figures, as are used in research. And perhaps that ratio in Europe is not quite 600, maybe it's only 300 times, but it's certainly going to be, because you may have a relatively larger research use, but it's still going to be hundreds of times as many animals used in agriculture. And although some animals may suffer very severely in research, because of the controls and standards, I would not say that they will suffer, on average, more severely than animals used for food. So that's why I'm going to focus on the issues of progress that we've made in the treatment of animals raised for food. Now, here's one thing that used to exist in the European Union until very recently, until January the 1st of this year. It was legal in the EU to keep breeding sows, these are the breeding pigs that produce the pigs that are sent to market, in these conditions, in very narrow stalls. They're there, they're not just there a few hours, they're kept like this for their entire pregnancy, a duration of months, then they're briefly outside it to give birth and to again be made pregnant, but they will spend the majority of their lives in these narrow stalls, unable to stand up, turn around, no straw for bedding, nothing like that. That became illegal in Europe in beginning of this year, although my understanding is that the directive has, sorry, in the European Union I should say, not in Europe, should remember where I am. The directive is not completely enforced as yet, but we hope it will be. And it's this way of keeping sows is still legal in the United States and a number of other countries. But progress has been made in getting rid of it, starting in the United Kingdom in 1999. 2001, the EU indicated that it was going to ban it, and the ban came into effect, as I said. Just by way of comparison, in the United States, there have been a number of bans in particular states, usually as a result of citizen-initiated referenda, with various phase-out periods, which the Californian one is by far the most significant because of the size of that state. And I think it certainly helped in the debate in California in 2008 to be able to say that Europe is phasing this out. I mean, I wouldn't say it made a huge difference. I think the biggest difference was that people actually learnt how their pigs are kept, which they didn't know before the debate. But the fact that Europe was phasing this out, I guess at least some Californians didn't want to be thought of as notably crueler than Europe in respect of the way they treat animals. Here's the standard battery cage, again, as it used to be, and still is in a number of other countries. Extremely crowded, no nesting area for the birds to lay their eggs in, and that there's another view. Because of the crowding, the hens get rubbed against the wire, and they get pecked. The crowded birds peck each other, and they lose their feathers. So at least these standard cages also the European Union banned, and they've been replaced by enriched cages, which are not, by no means a paradise for hens. I think they're still quite crowded. They still have quite limited space. The nesting boxes are some kind of advantage, but they're not a kind of real nest, as you might imagine. So I think there could still be significant improvements. But here too, there has definitely been progress made, and it is to some extent being followed now in the United States and in some other countries. So that's good, but of course, to say this applies through the European Union, and the other 20 nations that are part of the Council of Europe are not obliged to comply with it, and obviously it would be very good for those that are that do not have similar laws if they enacted similar laws as well. And there are many practices that still continue that are clearly cruel. This is known as, well, now known in the industry as beak trimming. When I got involved in this issue, I was mentioned in the introduction, I wrote Animal Liberation in 1975, so I was doing the research for it in 73, 74. If you looked at the industry magazines, the magazines put out for the egg industry by egg producers, they referred to this procedure as debeaking. This is debeaking, cutting off the beak of the chicks, which was a standard procedure because otherwise, when you crowd them together in cages, these are for the laying hens, they will peck each other, and the stronger birds will draw blood from the weaker ones, and then this produces a kind of increased pecking, and they will kill each other, or stronger birds will kill the weaker birds. So debeaking was a standard term for removing the end of the beak with a hot blade, as shown here, without any pain relief. The industry decided, after Animal Liberation and a few other critics started talking about debeaking, they decided this was not the right word to use, so it's now known as beak trimming, like trimming your fingernails. But it's much more severe than trimming your fingernails because a chicken's beak is how it relates to its environment. It has to have nerves in the beak to sense whether something on the ground is an insect it might eat, or a grain it might eat, or a pebble that it isn't going to eat. So it's a very sensitive organ, not at all like cutting your fingernails. And here's quite a recent draft report from the European Food Safety Authority, which talks about the acute distress from debeaking, which is still standard in this industry. So that's something else that needs to be addressed, these kinds of questions of mass industrial agriculture and what are the things that it continues to permit despite the progress that's been made. As far as broiler chickens have been concerned, although there is an EU directive on this from 2007, I think, there's still, it's a rather weak directive. It doesn't do anything as dramatic as prohibiting the sow stalls or the laying cages. And I think that we still have very serious welfare problems with the mass rearing of chickens for meat. That is certainly something that also needs to be addressed. And another problem which you can't perhaps show so well in a picture is the problem of the breeding birds for the meat chicken industry. Now, as I said, the meat chickens have been bred to put on weight very fast. That's how you produce a cheaper bird, how you compete, by having birds that have a strong innate appetite, they want to eat a lot, and then you give them as much food as they can eat, and they put on weight very fast, and you send them to market very fast, and you have cheap chicken. But who are the parents of these birds? Well, the parents have to have the same genetic strains. The parents exist to produce thousands of eggs, or as many eggs as possible, which will then go into these factories. But the parents have to have the same genes as their offspring. So they also have to be bred to want to eat a lot. But if you give them as much food as they will eat, they become very fat very fast, and with the ones that you're going to sell at 6 weeks of age, it doesn't much matter if a few die along the way, their legs collapse, it's not economically significant, and the rest of them will get killed at 6 weeks anyway. But the breeding birds, you want to be sexually mature, and you want them to have several months in which, or a year or two in which they're breeding. If you allow them to put on weight so fast, they're going to drop dead at quite a high rate because they haven't been actually bred to live a long life. They've just been bred to put on weight fast up to 6 weeks. And they would get extremely obese, and a lot of them would die. So the producers don't want this, so they restrict their feed. As this says, they're getting something like between, at least for a period, for about 18 weeks, 17 weeks, they're getting only a quarter to a third of what they would eat if you allowed them to eat freely. That means that they're chronically hungry. They're permanently kept hungry. And as this same European Food Safety Authority draft report says, this results in abnormal behaviour and so on. And I think they're clearly suffering. I think we can conclude, as you would expect, that birds that are chronically hungry and not getting enough to eat are suffering. So there's another problem with the whole sort of bred-in, built-in genetic problem, if you like, with the way the industry functions. They've created this weird breeds of birds that are not actually geared to living a normal lifespan. And so in order to get them to live something like a normal lifespan, not fully normal, but still, you have to actually half-starve them to get them to live like that. Let me also not forget about fish, because again, in terms of numbers, the number of fish we catch actually far outstrips the number of land animals that we eat. This is an estimate from a website called Fish Count, suggesting that the number of wild-caught fish is in excess of 1 trillion, 1,000 billion fish, without including bycatch. As I said, there is evidence that fish feel pain. Have a look at Victoria Braithwaite's book if you want to check that. And even though wild-caught fish have lives that are not affected by human intervention. There is virtually no humane slaughter of fish. The conventions we have for humane slaughter of cows and pigs and chickens and so on, there is nothing like that for fish. And the Dutch and the Norwegians are conducting some trials with humane slaughter of wild-caught fish and also of fish farming, but it's tiny at this stage. So we have a pain problem, I think, with the fishing industry as well, apart from overfishing issues that I won't talk about. Also, let me mention other things that are not covered in the European Union, really. There is no directive for dairy cows, and dairy cows are increasingly going indoors. I was just speaking to Dan Jorgensen, a member of the European Parliament from Denmark, who said that in the last 20 years, Denmark has gone from having most of its cows outside on grass to having 75% of its cows never going on grass, just permanently indoors. So we are developing a lot more animal welfare problems with a more intensive dairy industry in Europe as well. The other thing that is not regulated in the European Union is the length that you can, time that you can transport an animal. So there is an effort in the European Parliament to have an 8-hour limit on how long you can transport an animal. So far that has not gone anywhere, but that is certainly something that I think needs to be looked at as well. Okay, so let me just say a little bit in winding up. I don't want to go too far over the hour, but just briefly some of the things we can look at. So, are we making progress? My answer is yes, we are. This is more general. I have a book called The Expanding Circle, which talks about that idea I just briefly mentioned, suggesting that we have been, over the long term, making moral progress. The same idea has been supported much more recently by Steven Pinker of Harvard University in a much bigger and better documented book than mine called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which I think is an interesting study of long-term progress in civilization in which Europe has played a central role going back since before the Enlightenment. So yes, I think in the long run we are making moral progress, and part of that progress is our progress towards animals. Pinker incidentally agrees, although he's not someone who's known as an animal rights advocate particularly, but he gives the example from his own field of psychology of experiments on animals, and talks about experiments that he himself did as a student, which he now thinks are horrific, and which most of his colleagues would agree with him were horrific. So yes, we have been making moral progress. I think that gives us some hope for thinking we will continue to do so. And here's a couple of examples. So we have had a significant increase in vegetarianism. This is just showing the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom, the thick line above, the US, the more bumpy line. We are getting more people concerned enough about animals to wish not to eat them. And also, of course, some of these are people who are vegetarians for the environment or for their health, but I think it all helps. We are even now, interestingly, in the United States, seeing a decline in meat consumption. For the first time, really. It's been steadily up forever, more or less, I guess, probably since the start of the United States. And now it's actually topped out. If you look at this, beef topped out in the 1970s, but you could say, well, that was just because people were shifting to chicken, the red line that goes up until about 2008. But now that has started to drop as well, and nothing else is taking it up. So Americans, after eating huge amounts of meat, more than in Europe, are starting to think for various reasons that this is not a good thing, and are starting to move against it. That's very encouraging. If I wanted to discourage you, I would show you a slide of meat consumption in China, which regrettably goes the other way, no doubt because of their increasing affluence. But we have to hope that they too eventually will learn from other countries that this is something with very negative consequences, both for themselves And the environment is clearly one of the factors that's going to be important in the future of animals. So this slide that I showed you before shows an animal welfare-friendly farm. But that's not the only question. Although I'm here to talk about animal welfare, I think you can't separate, in terms of the ethics of eating animals, you can't completely separate animal welfare questions from environmental questions, particularly greenhouse problems. And so this beef in particular may be more animal welfare friendly than the chicken production I showed you, but it's actually significantly worse in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization said that a few years ago, pointing out that the livestock sector generates more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transport sector. People are starting increasingly to realize that. And it's also significant to understand that just the fact that the beef or the dairy is organically produced, that the cattle are on grass, it's good for animal welfare, but it's actually worse for climate change. Per kilo of beef or dairy products produced, you get larger greenhouse gas emissions when ruminants eat grass and their digestion process releases methane, very potent greenhouse gas, than if you were feeding them on grain. Not that I'm suggesting you should feed them on grain, rather I'm just saying there isn't really a sustainable way of producing beef and dairy products. So I think there's going to be increased pressure for environmental reasons on that as well. And then the question is, well, what are we going to do about that? There's something like this, I guess, which is both reasonably animal welfare friendly and not carbon intensive particularly. This free-range egg production, rather nice unit. This is actually in New Jersey, not far from Princeton University, but there are plenty of European units that look like this. The animals have plenty of pasture, and then at night for protection from foxes and to make sure they lay their eggs in one place, they go into this shed which is on wheels so it can be moved around so the pasture remains fresh. So that is something that I guess you could say is reasonably acceptable animal welfare standards, as well as not having environmental problems. Or the other option is this. This is the website of an organisation called New Harvest, which is trying to develop plant-based alternatives to meat. Or when I say plant-based, a variety of different alternatives, one of which is actually growing meat in vitro. So if this would be really meat, this would be something from cells from beef or from pork or something like that. But it would be grown in vitro. There would be no animal that would suffer from it, no conscious being at all. And it would be environmentally more friendly. There would be no methane release, and it would be a better, more effective use of the resources that go into it. So there is work going on in this in both North America and Europe. I think in Europe, it's particularly the Dutch government that has financed some of this research, and I think it's a promising alternative, and it may be that in the long run we'll solve some of these animal welfare and environmental problems with a kind of a technological solution that produces food that is nutritious, that is environmentally friendly, that has no animal welfare costs, and that is economically competitive and competitive in terms of palatability of taste with the animal products we have today. So with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for your attention.